Hello. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Deloitte Business New Zealand Election Conference. It's going to be a humdinger, I think, this conference, because we really suddenly have ourselves a ball game in this election, don't we? A month ago, the media was, not kidding, pretty much asleep at our microphones. We thought it was going to be quite an amble into this election, bogged down in policy, maybe, but it looked like a shoo-in for National. But there has been so much change and so much upheaval. And as Peter Dunn said earlier in the week, there is a mood for change. That might not be a mood in this room, but what might change look like for you and for business and the economy if that occurs? Just cast your mind back in terms of how much change there's been. Just before Christmas, none of us picked it, did we, that John Key would resign? I don't think half the National Party picked it, to be honest. And just before Christmas, we had Bill English as the new Prime Minister. And that's how it all went along quite nicely for a few months, steady as she goes. And then Andrew Little said in that one interview, polls weren't looking so great. I did actually consider at one stage that I might resign. And then, bugger me, he was gone by morning tea the next day. And it was extraordinary. Jacinda Ardern came in and began talking about what her policy slogan might be, and in the media we were having jokes because Labour's policy was a fresh approach. What was it going to be this time? A really fresh approach, even fresher than last time. And then Jacinda just cracked on, and she had it done in the course of a day. Let's do this, she said, and it's stuck. In the midst of all of this, we had Matiria Ture, of course, who made that extraordinary call, and it was a slow death, a slow demise to her political career, but she admitted that benefit fraud, and suddenly she was gone too. James Shaw left holding the leadership on his own, Mickey kind of without Minnie, George without Mildred, and now he's really charged with making sure the Greens don't die in this election. They're polling below 5%. Like I said, the change is incredible. And I was talking about this change, met with a group of girlfriends at lunch this week, and I had my phone in my handbag next to me, and it was, vibrated a couple of times. Someone's trying to get hold of me, heard a couple of dings, news alerts coming through. By about the 6th, I said, hang on a minute, I just have to check this. Picked up my phone, and Peter Dunn had gone, National's coalition partner. And he was the one who said, mood for change, I think I need to step aside. And all I can think about in all of this is Winston Peters, because he's gone very quiet all of a sudden, hasn't he? And I can imagine him at home in the evenings, whiskey in that little short glass, ice tinkling up against the side, and he thinks he's just sitting there and biding his time. Because now he's not just kingmaker, potentially he could be queenmaker. He's the guy who's holding the balance of power. And while everything's been imploding around him, he's just sat there and watched. You've got others coming through as well. Gareth Morgan. Now, some of his policies are incredibly radical, but he's resonating. He's getting some movement in the polls. Made a bit of a faux pas the other day, just quietly. The old lipstick in a pig column comment wasn't that well thought through. But still, he has his level of support. David Seymour with ACT, Epsom, will they listen to National? Will they vote him in again? So much going on, but as I've just talked about here, it's all about being personalities and leaders and whatnot. What we haven't been talking about is policy. We haven't been getting down to the nuts and bolts of what potentially these governments might look like. If National has to team up with New Zealand First, how does that shake down? What if Winston goes left? What does that mean for you, for the economy, for business in general? So this is your opportunity today. I'll be putting some questions to these panellists and politicians. But, you pay these buggers, make them accountable. You ask some questions of them, because the media doesn't always, particularly the mainstream media now, ask the questions that you need answered. So please do grab that opportunity with both hands and put the questions that you want answered to these men and women today, and I'll make sure they answer them for you, I promise. I've seen some of the people who are sitting here today. There's a table, I think, from Federated Farmers, because the sort of questions that are coming up, the water tax. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for your bottled water? What does that mean for farming, our incredibly important industry in this country? Immigration, if Winston Peters does get in, and it looks like he will help form a government, what does that mean for our workforce? Capital gains tax. Most OECD countries have them. What is Labour's going to look like if they do introduce one? Will they renegotiate the TPP? There are so many questions. We could fill the day putting these questions to our panellists, but please do make use of the opportunity that you have today. It's a rare one. It's a very close election. We've got all of the big players here, so it's your time to ask those questions. Later in the day, of course, Winston Peters, Jacinda Ardern and Bill English will all be speaking to us as well. We're going to open today with a panel of our senior politicians talking front and centre about the economy. I'd like to invite those gentlemen to the stage, if I may. Stephen Joyce from National, Grant Robertson from Labour, Fletcher Tabuteau from New Zealand First, James Shaw from the Greens, David Seymour from ACT, and Jeff Simmons from the Opportunities Party. Anywhere you would like, get the questions if you like. I feel like this is a bit of a beauty pageant, really. 36, 24, 36.
Here you go, okay.
Ms. Venezuela. It's brilliant. Each of the panellists will be given 5 questions. They know what those questions are to answer. You will see those questions, I think, come up on the screen behind you. Gentlemen, you will be given a bell at the conclusion of your time to wrap up, as we do at all of the New Zealand Radio Awards events. When people go on too long, we crash over the top of them with AC/DC music. So if you do go too long, I might have to install that. I would like to invite our first speaker to the stage, Stephen Joyce, the National Party representative today, to the lectern, please, to address us on the economy.
Well, kia ora, good morning everyone. Great to have the opportunity to be there as we get down to what I think is the most important part of the election campaign, which is the competing views of what New Zealand should do over the next 3 years. So basically it comes to that. As Rachel has pointed out, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on around it, which is politicians rearranging the chairs and so on, and we've got a fair few chairs up here today. But ultimately it comes to what is the competing visions for New Zealand over the next 3 years. And I'm going to throw it out there that, and I think with a reasonable level of support from across the community, that New Zealand is heading in the right direction. We're seeing strong economic growth. Last year we were the 5th fastest growing economy in the OECD. We're seeing strong job growth, which is really important. 180-odd thousand jobs in the last 2 years, prediction of another couple of 100,000 over the next few years. And also we're in fiscal surplus. I can't tell you exactly how much. There's a certain event later on this morning. We're sort of tag teaming it. We all have to head off and play with our calculators around lunchtime today and tell you exactly how much. But nevertheless, we are in a privileged position as a country compared to, say, the UK, the US, Australia, Japan and others. And I was talking to the Australians the other night and they said, we just love to have your fiscal position as a country, because they don't get to have the conversations that we have as a country now about how to allocate a fiscal surplus. And that's the hard work of New Zealanders over the last several years and the hard work of New Zealand businesses. So we get to discuss the investment in infrastructure, which is massive by any indications, $32.5 billion over the next 4 years. We get to discuss public services, the investment there, which is also very big. For example, in the last budget, we've just allocated the biggest health additional expenditure in 11 years. And also we get to debate family incomes, which is really important because a lot of the debate is about how do we bring along people who perhaps are struggling a bit. How do we ensure that they have a stake in the New Zealand economy? It's fine to talk to them about the economy growing, but unless they see it in their pockets in terms of an increased income and things that they can spend money on, then actually why should they buy into it? And that's important. So that's all the sort of things that we'll discuss later on today. But this morning we're discussing businesses. My background is business. Before I came into politics, I ran a little radio company, grew to a reasonable sized radio company, 650 staff. But I'm reminded this morning that actually 650 staff in a world context is still a pretty small business. And in fact, New Zealand is a nation of small businesses. I look around this room and I can see maybe 1 or 2 that would qualify as large businesses by world standards. So we are small, which means we have to get things going in our direction if we're to compete and win successfully on the world stage. Which is why I think it's so important to work with business and not against business. Because we are a small country. We need our businesses to be able to succeed. So there's a lot of debate in this campaign. I think there's going to be a lot more about what exactly to do to business over the next few years? Shall we add more taxes? Shall we go out and change wage bargaining, centralise it perhaps? Shall we cut off the supply of skilled workers, or at least cut it in half? Those sorts of things are what I would call working against business. Now, we need our businesses to succeed, because it's the businesses succeeding that drives the taxes, not just for the staff, but also for the businesses themselves, which is actually ensuring that New Zealand succeeds. So I reckon there's a very straightforward vision for New Zealand. Our companies are growing. There's some fantastic opportunities out there in the world today. We just need to make sure that we're working with our businesses to succeed, to get out there, to take those opportunities and not actually ankle tap them here at home while they're trying to do their best to take on the world and win. Is that my 5 minutes?
Almost.
Almost. That's pretty good, isn't it? Not too bad. Can I thank you very, very much for your time here this morning. Looking forward to the discussion. Cheers.
Minister, I am going to have to get you to take you through those 5 questions, though.
Oh, you want me to do those?
Yeah, I do.
Very good. Sorry.
That's okay.
I thought we were going to do those in the questions. Okay. Now I'm in trouble now. I can't see them.
Okay,
Here we go.
Will you cut? Okay.
Will you cut business and personal tax rates within the next 3 years? Prep for you today. Tell you after that. Number 2, actually, we'd like to, I think, is the answer I'd say at this point, but we'll just have to wait and see. Will you commit to no new taxes? Yes. Will you keep central government spending below 30% of GDP? Yes. Will you keep the Reserve Bank's sole focus on fighting inflation? Absolutely. The Reserve Bank has been an important part of the progress that New Zealand has made over the last few years. And will you support TPP 11? Yes, because I think we have one chance between now and the end of the year to get that thing signed. And the opportunity for New Zealand is huge, places like Japan and Vietnam. And if we want to go and renegotiate it, we can, but then so will everybody else. And I tell you, you'll be here in 6 years' time still discussing it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. Just a reminder, you will get to put questions to the Minister at the end of this panel. Can I please now invite to the stage Grant Robertson from Labour.
Kia ora, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with the battlers and toilers of the New Zealand economy. It's a great opportunity for us to be here and present ourselves. I will answer the questions as I go, and then if I haven't mopped any of them up, I'm sure Rachel will hold me to account for that. If you want to know the Labour Party's vision for the economy in 2 words, it is shared prosperity. We need to make sure that an economy that is growing is actually delivering benefits to the full range of New Zealanders. And right at the moment, while the high-level indicators in the economy look good, you only need to go down one level below that to see that not everybody is benefiting. Wages in New Zealand in the last year, 2/3 of people got a wage rise less than inflation. Looking at the latest report from the Ministry of Social Development, the top 10% of earners after housing costs over the last 8 years, their wealth has grown at twice the rate of the bottom 10% of earners. The Chartered Accountants Association are represented here today. They just released a report recently that picked up the message from both the IMF and the OECD that growing inequality actually harms our economy, and we need to do something to address that if we want to have a true sense of prosperity in New Zealand. We are in a productivity recession. Bernard Doyle from JB Ware put an article about that out just recently. Flat GDP per hour worked, and in fact, GDP per capita in our last 6 months has actually been going backwards. In the end, relying on population growth and selling housing to one another is not actually an economic plan, or at least certainly not a sustainable economic plan. We need to grow exports. The government set itself a challenging goal of increasing exports as a percentage of GDP from 30% to 40%. We're now at about 26%. If we are going to deliver high-wage jobs and a sustainable economy for New Zealand, we need to do significantly better than that. So earlier this year, we began setting out our plan for the economy. The first step in that was to set the framework of the budget responsibility rules. This is to give confidence and certainty to all of you that this is the framework we'll work within. So that commits us to sustainable surpluses, reducing debt as a percentage of GDP to 20% within 5 years, focusing on long-term priorities for spending, in particular restarting contributions to the super fund immediately, and we will do that immediately after the election and then in an ongoing fashion from there. Undertaking a tax working group to look at the structure of our tax system. It is our view that our tax system is not well balanced at the moment. Almost every other country in the OECD has some form of tax on assets and wealth. We are building on National's capital gains tax that they introduced this term to have a bright line test so that within 5 years, if you flip an investment property, you will pay tax. We're asking that tax working group to look at that and say, is there more that we can do in that area? And we have committed within our budget responsibility rules to keeping government spending as a percentage of GDP around the long-run trend of 30%. Went up to around 32% just after the global financial crisis. It's come down a bit from there. You'll see from our fiscal plan that we keep it just under 30% over the next 4 years. And also we're going to actually hold ourselves to account and actually have a body that will ensure that you'll see that we're keeping those budget responsibility rules updated. We produced a fiscal plan. It was audited by Burl. Even Jordan Williams said the numbers added up, so we went and checked them again just to make sure once he said that. But actually we stand confidently behind that. We've got the pre-fu today and we'll update that. Stephen gets his dream. He gets to lock me up for an hour in the middle of the election campaign. And then at the end of that we'll go back and look at our fiscal plan and update all of those numbers. In terms of the key priorities for us, it is about lifting productivity. That means a significant investment in skills. We've already talked about our 3 years free post-secondary education and training program. We want a true partnership in the skills area. We used to have this between Business New Zealand, the CTU and the government. We want to rebuild that partnership. We want more R&D in New Zealand. We still are well below the OECD average there. We think R&D tax credits sit at the core of making that work. Supporting more capital for small business by changing the incentives in the economy. A just transition to a rapidly changing future of work, and significant investment in regional development. A partner in the regions, not producing glossy brochures, but actually sitting down and developing real initiatives that will build jobs, and we've got a $200 million fund lined up for that. I'm going to answer the rest of the questions, Rachel, because you're looking at me from the corner of your eye telling me that I should be moving forward. So, very quickly, will you cut business and personal tax rates within the next 3 years? That's not our plan. We believe that there is a significant social and infrastructure deficit in New Zealand, health, education, housing, that is a priority now, as well as going through and developing the super fund. Will you commit to no new taxes? We've got to wait for the working group. Just note Stephen's commitment to no new taxes presumably is the same as the one they made in 2008 and when they promptly increased GST and brought in the bright line test, so I presume that's the same commitment. Yes, government spending will be around about 30%, projected to be just below for the next 4 years. We have committed to reviewing the Reserve Bank Act. We believe that monetary policy after 28 years in New Zealand does need another look. We are committed to keeping the inflation target within the PTA, but we do believe the Reserve Bank can play its role in the rest of the economy, looking at other issues such as employment and the overall wealth and well-being of the economy. We do want to renegotiate TPP 11. We have been long-term strong supporters of free trade, but we have to ensure that New Zealand governments can make the laws that they need to make in the best interests of New Zealanders. In particular for us, that centres around the fact that we want residential property not to be able to be bought by someone who has no intention of living in New Zealand and has no right to live in New Zealand. That was excluded by the government in the negotiations for the TPP. It's just what Australia has. We just want the same rights there, so we are prepared to renegotiate that. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a runway through there. Yeah, I know. Thank you so much, Grant Robertson. I'd like to invite to the stage now from New Zealand First, Fletcher Tabuto.
Thanks, everyone. I am not Winston Peters. So there you go. There's more than one voice out there. Another voice to add to the conversation, and it's a privilege to be here today. So I acknowledge Kirk, acknowledge my fellow MPs, and the candidates on the stage. Mr Joyce spoke to you about one of the world's richest, healthiest economies, and he has spoken in the past about a fourth-term government, what did you say, vaccinating against a Labor Green economic winter flu. I quite like the terminology. But we've also, to back him up, we have had Wheeler discussing and giving us quarterly monetary policy statements, and the last one spoke about projected growth of 3.1%, and then 3.6, 2.9 into the March 2 years from now. He also estimated employment growth of 2.4 right up to, down to 1.5, with labour costs rising up to 2.3. For voters, those numbers do sound comforting. Actually, they are less comforting than they sound, and for many of you in the room, you know it. GDP per person, for example, fell in the December and March quarters. The gross numbers that makes Joyce economies look healthy have been driven to a considerable extent by what is an immigration flood. When an immigration surge wears off, it leaves little, if any, positive durable effect on per capita GDP or well-being, and then our limited resources are to be shared and spread even more thinly against an unprecedented population surge. We all know that low interest rates aim to stimulate GDP growth, and so are usually applied when GDP or the economy isn't going so well. Well, they're incredibly low now, so what's going on? Actually, right now, Wheeler's 1.75 is roughly where Bollard's 2.5 was in relation to the bank's estimates of the neutral rate, the rate at which the OCR would be thought to be neither stimulating nor constraining the economy. But that still puts the OCR at a level which implies uncertainty or perhaps even crisis. Domestic inflation, the bit Wheeler can influence with his OCR, has been well over 2% for a year now. I thankfully can say I have met with many of you in this room today, so I know whilst for many of you the consumptive growth in the economy has been good for business, for many of you, on the other hand, trying to make a long-term investment decision has become perilous. You all know the headline growth figures being touted are superficial or misleading, in fact. And so New Zealand is in a productivity recession. And so for everyone, that highlights a big lack of investment by all players, by just about everyone in this room. In the absence of productivity gains, as described recently, our economy has relied on more people working more hours. Net migration provides a conveyor belt of fresh labour, but it comes with attendant bottlenecks in housing and infrastructure. Isn't that a politically correct way to phrase it? This has led to circumstances in New Zealand that actually we should all be ashamed of. I'm glad to say that many of you, at least in private, have admitted your concern to me about the direction this country is going, the homelessness and the poverty that we are experiencing now. You've said to me that this isn't the New Zealand that you want going forward. The profitability windfall for housing and infrastructure has not arrived, and with earning warnings from all the major listed construction companies this year, it doesn't look like it's coming anytime soon either. A lack of productivity has been a feature of many OECD countries around the world, but what makes us different is the associated and unprecedented population growth, now at 2%. We have critical issues and we have capacity pressures that do not exist to the same extent anywhere else in the world. Productivity is down because you guys don't know what the plan is. That has been the conversation for me with many of you. Where are we going? What's the plan? What's the vision for the country? How do we make good investment decisions when we don't know what's coming tomorrow, because we have a laissez-faire government that is reluctant to react but eventually does, and it does so poorly and in an untimely fashion. So my commitment to you here today is a New Zealand First government that will commit to a dialogue of long-term planning, of a vision that we all share for New Zealand going forward. You want certainty, New Zealand First will ensure that any of our discussions will be about certainty going forward and that long-term planning. If we are to have meaningful growth, not from unsustainable population growth, then certainty is the way forward. And I conclude by using a few facts that Mr Robertson used. Skill workforce planning. We used to communicate, we used to know what the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year numbers were for your skills gaps. We used to have that engagement, and what do you know? The government's role there was to train those people and make sure they were ready to fill the gaps that you saw in your industries. That's not happening now. Now we have an industry in the tertiary sector in particularly that it is means and ends in and of itself to create GDP, big numbers. But that's meaningless to you where you need skills and you need workers. So by way of answering the questions, I heard you shuffle, you've got a presence there. Will you cut business and personal tax rates within the next 3 years? I'll go with Mr Joyce on this one. We'll see. I have to admit that our preference is, well, we've got fiscal drag, and I think that needs to be corrected. It's not a commitment today, but I would like to be in a position to do it. Cut business taxes. Actually, we think that your feedback to us suggests that over the next 3 years, in terms of corporate competitiveness worldwide, we need to be looking to move in that direction. And it's not for me to say right now, but we are having those discussions, and that's the honest truth. We'll commit to no new taxes. Yep, absolutely. Will you keep central government spending below 30% of GDP? Yeah, in the long run average, absolutely. I hope I conveyed to you in the meat of my contribution that a New Zealand First government would have a larger role to play in the economy, but yes is the short answer. Will you keep the Reserve Bank's sole focus on fighting inflation? The short answer is actually no. The rest of the world's moved on to critical macroeconomic factors and where they take into the rate of growth, export growth and the value of the dollar, and employment as well as price stability. And many of you will know that Winston Peters has been working towards that with a private members bill. Will you support TPP 11? Absolutely not. I think it's a dead horse, a lame duck, and a complete waste of our trade missions time. What we will say is New Zealand First absolutely commits to the Japan bilateral, Russia, EU, the US, the United Kingdom, and actually we need to work on the CER and initiate closer Commonwealth economic relations. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Fletcher. Just a reminder again, we will let you put some questions to all of these panellists shortly. James Shaw now, the leader of the Greens.
Well, kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone. Stephen had his start in business before he came into Parliament, and so did I. I started off, for those of you who haven't met already, I started off at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and then co-founded a small consultancy. And one of the experiences I've been reflecting on recently was during the Great Financial Crisis, because we were based in London and a lot of our clients were large financial institutions, and because it was the Great Financial Crisis, they weren't paying us, and we were quite a small company. And so we had what we called the daily cash call, where every morning we would get up and at 8 o'clock in the morning we'd sit around and we'd say, who can we call today to get enough cash so that we can stay open tomorrow? And we would make the calls, and we'd get a little advance on that massive bill that they owed us and so on, and we'd keep the lights on till the following day. And then we'd do it again the following day. And the company's now doing pretty well, and so I'm very pleased that it worked. And I've been reflecting on this recently, because that idea of getting up every day and doing what's immediately in front of you and keeping the lights on for the following day and then getting up and doing it again, I think is a useful lesson in life. certainly for me recently. So, I agree with a lot of Grant's analysis that the headline numbers look pretty good, but when you scratch beneath the surface, that there's a lot of other information there that tells us that the whole picture isn't as rosy as Stephen suggests. An example, Stephen talks about job growth, and there has been job growth recently, and that sounds great until you realise that a lot of the people who are living in cars and garages and 16 people in a 3 or 4 bedroom home have jobs. They have jobs. Some of them have 2 jobs, and they still cannot make ends meet, and they still cannot put a roof over their family's heads. So that tells you that something else is going on, that just having a job is not a precondition, or it's not sufficient to get you out of poverty. We will be doing our full fiscals closer to the election. We wanted to get today's pre-fu numbers before we put the whole thing together. We had some indicative numbers a couple of months back, obviously, with the budget, but we wanted to get through pre-fu before we put that to bed. So we'll be releasing that close to the election. I also wanted to acknowledge Kirk and the team at Business New Zealand and the member companies of Business New Zealand, because I have found engaging with you since I became co-leader and now leader of the Green Party, depending on which week it is, really constructive and very helpful in terms of building our economic program. There were a couple of things that I've heard expressed to me, maybe just because it's me, but there are things that a number of business leaders in New Zealand have said over the course of the last couple of years, one of which is a growing concern that we are leaving a lot of people behind, even while we have a growing economy. And the other one is a lack of government leadership on climate change, which of course creates a very uncertain investment environment where a lot of businesses actually want to be moving into that. So the organising principle for the Green Party's vision for the New Zealand economy, the organising principle is that we will be a net zero carbon economy, a carbon neutral economy by the year 2050. And some of you, some of you will have known or read about or participated in the work that the Cross-Parliament All-Party Group Globe did on developing a series of scenarios, and 2050 is the earliest economic and technological date that New Zealand could achieve carbon neutrality. We are committed to that as the Green Party, and our intention in government is to provide the kind of leadership that would enable the economy and your businesses to get around that. By definition, a low carbon or a carbon neutral economy is highly productive, it's high wage, it's clean tech, it's high tech, and it's high value. And there are a number of industries in New Zealand that have been moving up that value chain recently with a real intention to continue that drive. We believe that creating that program over the course of the next 30 years to become carbon neutral will provide that kind of structure for us to move into that much more highly productive, high value space. So a couple of quick responses to your questions. Will we cut business and personal tax rates within 3 years? Well, yes and no. So our intention when it comes to personal taxes is to reduce the bottom tax threshold, currently up to $14,000, from 10.5% to 9%, right? And that is in part because we want to ensure that people who are on lower incomes are able to soak up some of the increased costs that would arise from a proper price on carbon. Things that they don't currently have a lot of choice about whether to spend that money on, like, for example, petrol and so on. So you would see some consumer consumables go up, and therefore we felt that we had to give people that little bit of extra leverage there. So 97% of New Zealanders would get about $270 odd in the back pocket as a result of that. Bad news for this particular audience is that for every dollar that we earn above $150,000, you'd be paying an additional 7 cents in the dollar. So we wanted to introduce a new top tax rate of 40% above $150,000. That nets out positive. It's not huge. It's more of a revenue swap. In the first year, it nets out at about $163 million of additional revenue. The other thing that we've said previously is that we wanted to recycle revenue from the carbon tax into tax cuts for business. At the last election, we said that that would be a reduction of 1% in the corporate tax rate. We still have to do those numbers again today, and we're actually reviewing how we do that. So I can't commit to what we committed to in 2014 yet, but we'll have that for you before the election. Will we commit to no new taxes? No. So there are some things. We have said that we think that it is probably a good idea to have another tax working group. There have been two in the last 10 years, or just over 10 years. A number of the key recommendations were ignored, but we also need to look at the mandate of that review as well. We think it needs to be broader and to look at the whole tax and income and welfare model. But we also think that there are some things that we cannot wait 3 years for. So we have a real sense of urgency around the housing crisis and around the climate crisis. And so we would like to introduce a comprehensive capital gains tax in the first term, as well as an effective price on greenhouse gas emissions. Overall, I'm fairly entranced with a lot of the work that Denmark has been doing recently in thinking about the long-term shift in its tax base between now and the year 2050, which is to reduce... Oh, golly, was that 5 or is that 1 minute to go?
It's okay.
All right, I'll finish. Denmark, look it up. Will we commit to keeping government spending below 30% of GDP? Yes, across a cycle. If the economy shrinks, and it's not projected to in the next few years, but if the economy shrinks, that's a particularly bad time for the government to withdraw spending from the economy. So I think, if the economy shrinks, you want to maintain it. As it grows again, then you pull it back so that you keep that long run average. Will we keep the Reserve Bank focus on inflation? So we've been quite critical about the single decision maker model when it comes to setting the OCR, and we're more interested in doing what a number of other countries do, which is to have a committee that looks at that. Our priority really is on deposit insurance. New Zealand is now the only OECD country after Israel brought in deposit insurance last December, not to have deposit insurance. And on the TPPA 11, some of the things that were the most frustrating about that, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but there are a couple of really key provisions, most notably the investor-state dispute settlement systems, that were there largely at the insistence of the Americans, and a lot of the IP reforms as well. And what I cannot understand is, now that the Americans don't want to be in it, why we would retain the things that they in particular were pushing us most hard on. And I just sort of think that maybe we ought to take a look at those things. I do note that the EU free trade deal that's being negotiated does offer some real hope when it comes to investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, because they, within the EU, are looking to regularise those and bring them into the justice system. And we think that that's probably the direction of travel that we want to go in before we commit to that inside the TPP 11. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James Shaw. At the other end of the spectrum now, we have David Seymour from ACT.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Kirk, to Business New Zealand and all of the members who have come along today. Let's just answer the questions. Will you cut business and personal tax rates within the next 3 years? Yes, ACT's policy is to cut to 10% up to 14K, 15 up to 48 and 25 thereafter, and to align the company tax rate at 25 too. The interesting thing is you can actually do that with the surpluses forecast over the next 4 years. Stephen will tell you, no, you can't, because on a cash basis we've already spent it on infrastructure. First time we've heard the government talk about cash accounting for 9 years. Of course, all through the GFC and the deficits, we were quite happy to focus on the headline rate. But the fact of the matter is that we do actually have room for much more substantial tax cuts than has been advertised. We've costed it and we've put it out there. And we also walk the talk. The ACT Party has run an entire parliamentary caucus for the last 3 years on one MP's salary. That's real efficiency that can't be matched by many of my competitors. The next question is, will you commit to no new taxes? I think we'll take that one as read from ACT. Will you keep central government spending below 30% of GDP? Well, I'd certainly hope so. On current trajectory, it's tracking down towards 28%. And that's a very healthy thing. Will you keep the Reserve Bank's sole focus on fighting inflation? Yes, absolutely. Outside of the tinfoil hat wearing Looney Tunes brigade, the facts of the matter are, and I saw Dom Brash here somewhere, that you can print money and change the nominal exchange rate, but you cannot change the real exchange rate. You can just get a lot of inflation. So on orthodox monetary policy, absolutely. And would we support TPP 11? Yes, and I think one way to think about that, I'll carry on with Denmark, is to think about a country of about 5 million people, a jurisdiction perhaps like Colorado or British Columbia, and say, oh no, we don't want to have an arrangement of trade agreements and linkages so that we can do business with the other people in our region. We'd like to be 5 million people almost isolated because we feel like we're protecting our sovereignty by doing so. If you went to Denmark or BC or Colorado and made that proposition, they'd say you're absolutely nuts, and the people who say that are nuts. But there is a proposition here that is important, is that Stephen and I are the only people on this stage whose parties have not actively campaigned on xenophobia in the last 3 years. And that's one of the critical choices at this election, is that we have to be a country that is open and proudly standing in the world, who welcomes global links rather than pushing them away for petty domestic politics. And I'd make a wider comment about where we are right now, is that we've enjoyed 9 years of stable, economically orthodox government that has allowed a great deal of investment and prosperity, arguably unprecedented in New Zealand history. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it could become very, very different. And those of us who want to continue having orthodox economic policy actually have to be a bit less complacent. We've actually got to make the building of a free society a deed of courage and a project worth going for. And we have to look at some of the areas where we haven't done so well. We have to look at the fact that we built 39,000 houses in the 1974 peak, only 30,000 this year, and it's just not credible to say that we're at the biggest building boom in New Zealand history. If we look at the fact that we have the third largest gap in the OECD between the top 10% of learners at our schools and the bottom 10%, it's just not credible to set targets, see NCEA rates rise and say, oh well, despite the international evidence and despite the number of NEETs piling up, our education system is working for all kids. We actually have to take the initiative, and in the next government we should be not reforming the RMA, because the last 19 times haven't really worked, it seems. We have to replace it. We actually have to make that a project and a deed of courage in the next Parliament with an Urban Development Act, as foreshadowed by the Productivity Commission, that allows people to build homes. Because if you don't do that, you're going to continue to have the unrest, you're going to continue to have the accusations of poverty and inequality, and you're going to continue to say, well, pouring $17,120 per citizen through government coffers every year isn't enough. The political call will be to raise taxes and pour more money into that same broken model. So I'm very proud of the role that ACT has played in the last 3 years, even just the one of me, prodding the government, first of all keeping the government there and keeping our economic policy settings relatively stable, but also prodding them to address some of those longer-term consequences. And if we want to have the kind of government that we've had and better, then what it's going to take is to make ACT not a party of one, but 2, 3, 4, 5 MPs, because that's the only way that we're going to continue with orthodox, stable economic policy that addresses our long-term problems in the next 3 years. Thank you very much.
David Seymour, thank you very much. Jeff Simmons from the Opportunities Party.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Kirk and Business New Zealand, for the opportunity to speak. No marketers in the room to get that joke. Okay, fine. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Jeff Simmons. I have 17 years' experience as an economist in Treasury, running my own business and working over in the UK and the civil service there. And really the Opportunities Party was formed by Gareth Morgan back in November on the idea of that we are not left, not right, we will just do what works, take evidence-based positions based on dealing with New Zealand's long-term issues. So in our view, both Labour and National do a pretty good job of managing the day-to-day government, but both are reasonably myopic when it comes to the long-term challenges that our country faces. And I'll talk about some of those in a few moments. I will briefly answer questions 3, 4 and 5 and come back to 1 and 2 if you can keep up with me there. So, will you keep government spending below 30% of GDP? Well, there's no rationale for that level of spending. As an economist, I have to say there's no proof that makes any difference to economic performance around the world. What we're committed to is good quality government spending. And I think we can all agree at the moment that there's plenty of poor quality government spending that we can get rid of to fund any new spending that we want to do. So, for example, our Thriving Families package, which is focused on lifting, investing in our youngest citizens in an evidence-based fashion, will be fully funded by means testing New Zealand superannuation. And clearly that is a far better investment for our country. Will you keep Reserve Bank's sole focus on fighting inflation? We don't plan any changes to that, but we do think that the Reserve Bank faces some challenges going forward. One, in the past we've had troubles with lowering interest rates and stoking housing speculation. I'll come back to that issue. But secondly, we are nearing the zero bound. And other countries have hit the zero bound overseas during a recession and haven't had any more room for monetary policy to operate. And I think as a country we need to start having that conversation of what happens if we get another recession now and get down to the zero bound. What other tools do we need to explore? On the TPP, our view is that we haven't seen another cost-benefit analysis since the United States pulled out. We would like to see that work done before we commit to anything there. Now, coming back to 1 and 2, so the issue of tax, and it's here that I totally agree with Minister Joyce's comments that the government needs to work with business. And in our view, there are reforms that can be made that will improve fairness and prosperity in New Zealand if we're prepared to take the difficult decisions. As other speakers have pointed out, we have been in a productivity malaise for some 30 years. Most recently, it's been a productivity recession. But we have been facing a situation where basically New Zealand has relied on working harder rather than working smarter. Now, there's a number of reasons that we can debate for why that is the case, but certainly tax policy is a key part of that. And when Stephen says we don't want to work against business, well, actually, our tax policy does work against business as it currently stands. We don't need another tax working group to work this out. We had one in 2011, we had one in 2001 and 2010. We know what the results of those are, and we just need to implement them. Our tax policy is very simple. We want to impose a deemed minimum rate of return on all assets. All assets have to pay a certain level of tax. Now, if your asset is paying that minimum level of tax, similar to effectively a bank deposit, the risk-free rate, right? If your assets are already paying that level of tax, there is no more tax. If your assets are not paying that level of tax, then you need to pay the same amount of tax as if that money was in a bank deposit. That, in our calculations, will raise at least $11 billion, which we will circulate into income tax cuts. You can cut income taxes by roughly a third with that level of taxation. The bad news is, sorry, Grant and James, but that has to include the family home, because that is the biggest tax break in New Zealand that we face today. We have the lowest rates of tax on housing in the world. We have some of the highest house prices, relatively speaking, in the world, and we have the highest rates of investment in housing in the world. No wonder our businesses struggle for capital. No wonder we are struggling for productivity when so much of our asset base is tied up in buying houses off each other. It's not rocket science, folks. This is the elephant in the room for New Zealand's economic performance that we need to address and start the conversation on with the public. And that problem will only get worse if we put up the top tax rate, as we saw with the last Labour government. So that's an issue that we need to urgently address. It will be done in a tax neutral way. We don't want to increase tax overall, but we want to rebalance the tax system away from having the lowest taxes on property in the world to treating all investments the same, so that we get Kiwis investing in businesses that create jobs and exports, rather than trying to get rich bidding up the house prices off each other. It's the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, and it will come crumbling down. One final point, in terms of the positioning of the Opportunities Party, I find it embarrassing that this election currently looks like a game of The Bachelor, an episode of The Bachelor where Winston is holding the roses. We need to address this, New Zealand. We need a strong party that is prepared to work in New Zealand's long-term national interests with either Labour or National. Now, they are both too petty to work with each other. So the Opportunities Party is prepared to hold that ground, working with Labour or National, and providing stable, long-term, evidence-based policy within Parliament. Thanks.
Now, I know some of our politicians are a bit pressed for time, election year and all, but I'm going to come down and there are some roaming mics. If you've got a question, please do raise your hands and we'll come to you with a microphone.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Good morning, Greg Lowe from the Major Companies Group and also from Becca. And can I just thank all of our speakers this morning for your time and your contribution. The relationship between the government and business is vital, and together we are the mechanism to which to grow the economy, and that's the mechanism which increases the funding for you to do good things for our country. So I hope we're all on the same page around that. I wanted to ask two questions, if I could, one to Grant and one to James. Grant, I think we can understand the position you're taking around things like tax and some of the other messages that you're sending out in various coded forms over the last few days, but I did want to ask you a direct question about migration. So migration is something which gets a lot of emotional discussion around things like refugees or people coming to New Zealand who perhaps aren't coming here for the right reason. But you talked about growing exports, and so right now in New Zealand we have a shortage of non-skilled, semi-skilled and skilled labour. The productive sector, the agriculture sector is relying on non-skilled and semi-skilled migration to keep its wheels turning, and skilled migration is necessary for a number of business activities. I come from the services sector. Export services revenue means winning work overseas and producing some of that here in New Zealand, and for that you need a growing skilled migration base. We produce great graduates and great technically qualified people in New Zealand. We hire all of those people, but we need more of them. So can you be clear about what your attitude is towards skilled migration? Because if we slow down skilled and non-skilled migration where those people are needed for jobs in New Zealand, that will go against the growth of export earnings. And I'd just like to be clear about what you mean by that. James, can I ask you a question? You talked about I think the phrase you used was a net zero carbon economy by 2050, and you were quite clear that part of the mechanism for that was raising the price on, or putting a carbon price on, a number of consumable items. That effectively is raising carbon taxes. I'd like to know where are those carbon taxes destined for? Will they stay in the economy? Will they be used to reduce emissions? Because that's actually how we get carbon emissions down, or do they go off into the world markets?
Thank you. I'll start with you, James, if that question's just been fired to you.
Okay, so what we've said about the price on carbon is that would get spent domestically in the economy. So when we talk about a net zero carbon economy, that's actually to do with domestic emissions, right? So we know that it is technically and economically possible for New Zealand to domestically get its emissions down to net zero. And of course we know that the net component is composed largely of forestry, right? And so that some of the revenue that's raised from the carbon tax has to go back into ensuring that we're planting sufficient numbers of trees in order to soak up the bit that we cannot actually squeeze out of the economy. And there's a number of other measures in there as well. So, for example, one of the things that we've talked about is that we want to set up a green investment fund modelled on the UK's Green Investment Bank and the one in Australia, both of which were actually wildly successful before governments came in who preferred coal and shut them down. And those investment funds pulled in anywhere from $3 to $10 of private finance for every dollar, for every government expenditure unit as well. And so that would require an additional investment from us of about $100 million, and that money would come out of the price on carbon, and would have a target of it would be a fully commercial operation so that the market can trust that it's making its decisions on the same basis of any other investment fund, but it would also have targets to do with pulling about 1 million tonnes of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or out of the economy every year over time. So, and then the rest of it would be spent, as I said, on reducing personal and corporate tax rates in order to allow businesses and individuals to start making some choices. I was in another business event recently. Somebody said, won't people just pass those prices on to the consumer? I said, well, yes, that's the point. You actually want to send a price signal to people that things that have a higher embodied carbon in them are more expensive and things that are low are cheaper, and therefore that's where that drives innovation and research and development as people look for ways to drive carbon out of their supply chains and out of their products.
What sort of price are you thinking about? Because we're about $17 a tonne at the moment. What do you reckon?
Are we doing interaction or are we doing...
Stephen has a supplementary question, which is what would the price be set at? So we are going to say something closer to that when we do our fiscals. But we've committed and have for a number of election campaigns now to the idea of an independent climate commission that would advise on the price. So we would look at a starting price in the vicinity of somewhere between $20 and $25, but then you actually want to remove it from politicians. I don't think it should be in hands of politicians.
Okay. On the issue of immigration, Grant.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, look, we realise that immigration is a very important part of ensuring that our economy continues to grow and that we have the right mix of skills here. Nothing changes about that. What I think everybody recognises is that with the exceptional population growth that we've seen in New Zealand, that's put a huge strain on our infrastructure. And as a country, we have not kept up with that. We haven't built the houses, we haven't created the modern transport systems that we need to deal with that. So our policy is that we want to moderate that flow. We want to ensure that the high-skilled migrants that you want and these businesses in this room need will be coming into New Zealand. We've focused where we want to moderate the flows around particularly what happened with student visas and then the automatic 1-year open visa that you get if you've studied for a full year beforehand. We believe that system has actually been rorted and hasn't actually delivered the kind of skills that we would want in New Zealand. In addition, we think that there is more we can do to train New Zealanders up, and we think that should be a priority and that we should rigorously enforce the fact that if there are people available to work, we can support you to train them, then that's what we should do. I would make the point that the budget and indeed the pre-fu that will come out very shortly will actually see immigration returning to the long run average fairly over the next 4 or 5 years. What we're doing is actually putting in place policies that actually will ensure that happens. At the moment, we're just drifting along, assuming that that will occur. So we think we're taking a responsible approach. We've got a number of elements in our policy. We want more people to go to the regions. We want to create those regional skill shortage lists right across New Zealand. The government did do that in Christchurch. We think that we can do that and make sure that we are encouraging and supporting people to go and work in the regions. Also in areas like the construction industry, where we know we want more people. We've got our Kiwi Build program. We're prepared to issue a Kiwi Build visa as long as companies are also employing apprentices from New Zealand at the same time. So we understand it, but we are in a position now in New Zealand where we have failed to keep up with the infrastructure needs. We need to make sure we get on with that job and keep the flow going of migrants that are skilled but not at the levels that they have been lately.
Thank you for that, Grant. Don Brash, I think you've got a question for us here.
Grant, a quick question. You say that we haven't reviewed the Reserve Bank Act since it was passed in 1989, but didn't the Clark-Cullen government commission a major review of the Reserve Bank Act back in 2000, which concluded that single focus on inflation was the right focus for the central bank? And secondly, there was a select committee hearing, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, which again looked quite comprehensively into the Reserve Bank framework and again concluded that the single focus on inflation was the right focus. Why do you propose to change that?
Yeah, both of those reviews, well, one was a review and the other was a select committee inquiry. I think, Don, when you look at what's happened in the world since the global financial crisis, monetary policy is enormously challenged. Right around the world, reserve and central banks have been struggling to do what they need to do to lift their economies in the wake of that global financial crisis, and we think it is time to take a look at the overall settings. With all due respect to you and others who've been involved here, if we look to other jurisdictions, plenty of them have mandates that are beyond just inflation. We're not saying controlling inflation disappears. That's a vitally important role of the bank, but it is possible for central banks to walk and chew gum at the same time. We want to make sure that the bank is playing its part in our overall economic goals, and that's why we want to look at the overall health of the economy, and in particular the role in making sure that employment outcomes are considered. Okay. We want to do this in a considered way, but I think it's important for a party like us to be clear with business and with future Reserve Bank governors what our goals are.
Thank you, Grant. Another question down here.
Good morning. I'm Melissa Hodge from Foodstuffs. Aside from running supermarkets, our brands are New World and Pack and Save, we develop supermarkets, and we believe that the current RMA framework has been a huge handbrake on development, but also on the development of much needed infrastructure. So my question for all of the parties is, we have recently had a Productivity Commission inquiry on a new urban planning framework, and the Commission has recommended that a completely new framework be implemented, one that is much more developer friendly. I'd like to know the party's position on the Commission's recommendations.
Okay, we're a little short on time, but I'll start with you, Minister, if I can.
Absolutely. And I am going to have to turn into a pumpkin in a second, or we won't get Preview out, which will rather change the day. We're very supportive of the Productivity Commission's work. We'll have a bit more to say on that in the next little while, but I actually think in terms of urban development planning, I think it's interesting that not just the Productivity Commission, but groups as diverse as the EMA, Infrastructure New Zealand and the Environmental Defence Society have all come out and said actually we need to look at urban development planning in New Zealand, and we're certainly up for that conversation.
Okay, I'll get Grant your perspective on that too, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously we have to continue to make sure that we develop our cities and our towns in the way that is the most effective, productive and sustainable. I've got a suspicion if you did, as David said, and said let's rip apart the RMA and come up with something new, it would go down the pathway of Donald Trump, healthcare, Obamacare, etc. You'd end up with something that looks a little bit like the RMA. So, yep, we're prepared to continue to look at how we develop that. We think there's a lot of room to use urban development authority type approaches, and you've got a panel coming up very shortly where you'll hear a bit more about that, I'm sure. But our proposal is not to tear the RMA up.
And balance of power, Fletcher, I'll get you to have your perspective too, please.
Yeah, so by way of answer, absolutely committed. In fact, for the past several years, we've been trying to engage with the government because we have said publicly the RMA is a handbrake on investment and holding up good development. We've said you didn't need to go down the pathway of dealing with the Māori Party and bringing racial divide into the equation. So absolutely have leanings more towards what Grant said around actually moving forward productively rather than ripping up what we've got.
Thank you all. David Seymour, James Shaw, Jeff Simmons, Stephen Joyce, Fletcher Tapito and Grant Robertson. Thank you so much.